You stand now on the threshold of something old, something cold. Feel the air shift, heavy with the dust of 10,000 years, thick with the scent of forgotten fears. Tonight, the grand histories, the triumphs and the glories mean nothing. We are here to listen to the whispers, to tread softly through the ruined empires that crumbled not from invaders, but from the shadow forces they invited in. We peel back the soil of Egypt, Rome and Babylon, searching for the chilling threads of a darkness that connects every lost world. The curse of the unfinished Egyptian tomb. The ancient Egyptians believed that if a tomb was left unfinished when the owner died, their spirit would never fully rest, condemned to a perpetual, haunting anxiety. These unsealed burial sites, open to the night air and wandering desert shadows, were seen as breaches in the spiritual wall protecting the living. They believed this restless energy would seep out, slowly infecting the town nearby with unexplained sadness or creeping nightmares that were impossible to shake. The most chilling example is found near the Valley of the Kings, where Pharaoh's final resting places suddenly stopped. Some historians believe a terrifying plague or sudden war was to blame, but the priests wrote of something far worse. They warned of a psychic contamination, a darkness that simply made the labourers too afraid to touch the cold stone walls and finish the sacred work. The fear alone was enough to stop the work, and so the vast echoing spaces of the uncompleted tomb became a spiritual trap, not for the body, but for the soul. They remain monuments to an overwhelming, inexplicable fear that caused an entire civilization to abandon its most sacred duty. We are left to wonder if the unfinished crypts hold not gold or bodies, but only the endless, hungry silence of a forgotten spirit waiting for its final rest. This is a recurring motif. The eerie watchers of the Mayan pyramids. The great Mayan pyramids were not just temples for worship, they were also immense astronomical devices designed to track the movements of the sky. But the ancient priests believed that the wrong alignments, the coming together of specific stars, would open a spiritual gate, allowing entities they called star watchers to descend and observe the world. The massive structures acted like both a beacon and a protective shield. During times of astronomical convergence, the Mayans would not look up, but rather seal themselves within the stone walls. They believed that even a glimpse of the Star Watchers, who possessed shadow eyes, would drive a person instantly and permanently insane. The silence in the abandoned cities during these celestial events must have been absolutely deafening, broken only by the muffled sounds of ceremony deep within the stone core. The eerie part is the myth itself. The Watchers didn't need to speak or fight. They just stared, and the Mayans, great masters of math and time, feared nothing more than being watched by something outside of their own system of reality. Perhaps the mysterious abandonment of cities like Tikal was not a military retreat, but a collective decision to flee from eyes that never blinked. The secret, bloody alleys of Rome's Suburra. Ancient Rome's Suburra district was the most densely populated and dangerous area of the sprawling city. Beneath its loud, crowded streets lay an unsettling network of dark, forgotten alleyways where the sunlight never reached. This was the true underbelly of Rome, where murders and dark transactions happened daily, and where the authorities simply refused to patrol, preferring the dark to keep its own secrets hidden forever. The Romans had a fear of these hidden spaces because they believed that the very ground was thirsty, hungry for the countless bodies and spilled blood absorbed over centuries. They whispered that the shadows themselves were alive, capable of reaching out and pulling the lonely wanderer into an unseen final embrace. It was a place where human cruelty seemed to have awakened something inhuman and ancient. Even the famous Roman water systems, the aqueducts, were sometimes used as secret disposal routes, washing the evidence of terrible crimes out into the vast, silent sewers beneath the city. The Suburra was a symbol of Rome's moral rot, a permanent dark stain on the proud empire. The terrifying feeling that the ground is watching you remains a strong symbolic motif in these ancient cities. The whispering pillars of Nabta Playa. Long before the pyramids, ancient people in the African desert built a complex stone circle called Nabta Playa. This place is eerie not because of what it is, but because of its age and sophistication. The stones are carefully positioned to align with specific stars, acting as a cosmic calendar. But local legends say the stones aren't tracking time. They are listening to the sky. The nomads who lived near it for centuries avoided the site, claiming that on certain nights, if you place your ear close to the stones, you can hear a high, faint whisper that doesn't belong to any known human language. They believed the builders encoded something terrible into the stone itself, a warning or a dark message that is only played when the specific stars are in alignment. Think of the chilling dedication required to build a monument that speaks only to the stars and only in riddles. It suggests an awareness of something cosmic and terrifying, a deep knowledge of space and time that we have lost. These whispering pillars represent a truth that humanity was perhaps too fearful to write down, leaving only the silent stones to carry the weight of an ancient cosmic dread. The silent, staring statues of Easter Island. The huge statues, or moai, of Easter Island are famous, but their creepiest aspect is often overlooked. Many of them were deliberately toppled and left staring face down into the red dirt. Local legends say this act was done to trap the powerful spirits, or mana, inside the stone, preventing them from escaping and bringing chaos to the land. Before they were toppled, many statues had carved eyes made of white coral and red volcanic rock. The islanders believed these eyes were not just decoration, they were conduits, allowing the spirits inside the stone to gaze out and protect the tribe. Imagine the final, desperate act of the Rapa Nui people, going through the immense effort to blind their gods and force them back into the earth. The mystery of their construction is often discussed, but the profound, unsettling mystery is their destruction. Why would an entire civilization take such drastic action against its own protectors? Perhaps the spirits they trapped were not protective ancestors at all, but rather something terrible that had been drawn in by the intense, concentrated power of the statues, something that threatened to devour the island. The unexplained fear of the Indus Valley people. The Indus Valley civilization, which included the great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, remains one of history's deepest mysteries. We know they were advanced, with excellent plumbing and city planning, but they left almost no evidence of rulers, warfare, or large temples. They seem to have lived under a profound collective stillness. This absence of history is unnerving. The most unsettling detail is the lack of any significant weapons or defences. It suggests they either lived in a time of complete peace, or they feared something that walls and spears simply could not stop. Perhaps they knew of a deeper spiritual threat, a psychic invasion, or a slow, invisible contamination that made physical resistance pointless. Their abrupt disappearance is equally chilling. Cities were not burned, they were simply abandoned. It's as if the population all at once decided to walk away from their incredible creations, driven by a non-physical dread. The stillness of the ruins today echoes a terrifying silence that suggests the ancient inhabitants successfully escaped the thing they feared, but left us no warning. The cursed soil of Babylon's Hanging Gardens. The legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, if they existed as described, would have been a beautiful but deeply unnatural construction. Historians suggest such a massive effort to defy the desert required an almost obsessive need for control. The workers may have believed they were not just building a garden, but a magical shield, a living barrier against the terrifying creatures of the arid wasteland. The gardens were said to draw a vast, unnatural amount of water from the mighty Euphrates River, and the Babylonian priests believed this theft angered the primordial water gods, who were masters of chaos. They feared the spirits of the river would eventually demand a terrible, bloody payment for the insult to the divine order, causing the river itself to turn against the city. This curse is the most chilling explanation for why the gardens, vanished without a trace, almost as if the entire structure was swallowed whole. The soil of that specific area today is said to be bitter, rejecting any attempts to grow life, as if the earth itself remembers the insult to the river gods. The gardens are an analogy for an empire's hubris that invited a terrible revenge. The Oracle of Delphi's poisonous truths. The Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece was the most powerful prophet in the ancient world, but her method was deeply unsettling. She would inhale fumes from a fissure in the ground, entering a trance where she would whisper her cryptic prophecies. This gas was likely a sweet but mind-altering poison that warped her mind and body. The priests insisted that the smoke was the very breath of the Earth Mother Gaia, channeling divine truth, but the reality was horrifying. The world's most crucial decisions were based on the nonsensical ravings of a woman slowly being poisoned by the ground beneath her feet. The prophecies were less divine guidance and more the desperate final thoughts of a terrified, dying mind. This represents a profound, terrifying paradox: truth and power built upon destruction and madness. As the gas seeped up from the chasm, the oracle became a symbolic victim of the very earth she spoke for, a cautionary tale about the terrible cost of knowing the future. Her eyes, rolled back in her head during her trance, were the symbolic shadowed eyes that saw the worst of humanity, the strange, protective curses of Sumer. The Sumerians, who created the first known writing system, also created the first known curses inscribed on clay tablets and boundary stones. These were not just bad wishes, they were complex legal magical contracts designed to unleash horrific supernatural consequences on anyone who damaged property or moved a stone. They were early open loops of magical dread. These curses called upon terrible forgotten gods, not the grand gods of the sky, but the chthonic powers of disease and decay. One curse warned that the trespasser would be struck by a plague of weeping sores, and their name would be erased from all memory, a fate worse than death to the Sumerians. The land itself was protected by unseen, malicious contracts. To move a stone in Sumer was to risk eternal damnation, a terror that ensured property rights for millennia. The fear of an unseen plague or a lost name was a more powerful defense than any wall of brick. Every fragment of clay dug from the soil today may still carry a whisper of this ancient, carefully worded, binding curse, waiting for its next victim. The unseen, deadly dust of the megaliths. The massive stones of ancient structures like Stonehenge or the temples of Malta were moved by colossal amounts of human effort. Modern research suggests the builders used primitive tools, grinding the limestone and sandstone. This grinding released clouds of sharp, silica-rich dust that the workers breathed in every single day. The terrible truth is that the builders of these majestic, eternal monuments were slowly killing themselves from the inside out. They suffered from stone disease or silicosis, which caused scarring in the lungs, leading to weakness and death. They were sacrificing their lives not just spiritually but physically for the glory of the stones. Imagine the ancient worksite, the relentless rhythmic chipping, the thick white dust hanging like a ghostly fog in the air, and the hacking coughs of the men building eternity. The most terrifying curse of the megaliths was not magical. It was a slow, invisible, and very real poison in the air, connecting all those who toiled under the oppressive silence of the stones, the labyrinth of Crete's silent minotaur. The mythical labyrinth of Crete, where the monstrous minotaur was said to reside, likely had a real-world inspiration in the sprawling, complex palace of Knossos. The palace was so vast, with so many small rooms and twisting corridors, that people could genuinely get lost, trapped in a physical maze of stone and shadow. This confusion created a psychological prison long before any monster was involved. The terrifying part of the labyrinth myth wasn't just the monster, but the sheer, agonizing psychological dread of being unable to find the way out. Imagine the absolute silence, broken only by your own echoing footsteps and the dreadful thought that the Minotaur, or something worse, was just around the next blind corner. The palace itself became a conscious, cruel entity. The architects of Knossos may have intentionally designed the confusing layout to disorient visitors, reinforcing the king's power and divine connection. The legend of the monster was simply a powerful, frightening allegory for the fate of those who defied the absolute power of the palace. It is the perfect open loop, a structure designed to make you vanish forever. The haunted well of ancient China. In many ancient Chinese villages, the central well was the source of life, but also a source of deep, abiding fear. It was believed that the well was a direct gate, a symbolic imagery connecting the world of the living to the mysterious watery world of the dead. Objects or sacrifices tossed into the dark water were not just offerings, they were appeasements. The creepiest accounts tell of villagers who swore they could hear faint, echoing whispers rising from the black depths when the village was asleep. They believed these sounds were the voices of drowned ancestors, eternally thirsty, calling up to the living. If you looked down too long, the spirits could drag your reflection and your soul down into the eternal dark. Because of this intense fear, wells were often covered with heavy stone lids, not just for safety, but to seal the portal against the spirits. The collective agreement to avoid the well at night reveals a shared, pervasive dread. This simple, life-giving structure became the most potent symbol of hidden horrors and the thin line between this world and the next. The Terracotta Army's silent curse. The Terracotta Army of Qin Shi Huang in China, composed of thousands of life-size soldier statues, wasn't just built for protection, it was built to maintain the emperor's absolute control over the spirit world. The sheer repetition of identical, unblinking faces is unsettling, suggesting a hive mind whose only loyalty was to the dead ruler. The creepiest fact is that the workers who built the tomb complex were often sealed inside after its completion to keep the location and its secrets hidden. Their bodies, now part of the clay and the stone, became a secondary, invisible layer of the defense, a silent, perpetual sacrifice. The army wasn't just made of clay, it was built on human misery and death. This incredible concentration of power and fear creates an area of intense, psychic energy. Some believe the vast army isn't merely clay, but is infused with the collected, frozen spirits of the sealed workers, condemned to march forever for an emperor who already died. This massive, silent force represents a hidden horror far greater than any living army. The Druids' fear of the liminal space. Ancient Celtic Druids revered groves, springs, and certain stone circles because they believed these were liminal spaces, places where the veil between the human world and the spirit world was thinnest. These locations were treated with profound reverence and dread, as they were places of both great magic and great danger. They warned that travellers who accidentally wandered into a true liminal space at midnight could be caught by spirits, doomed to walk between worlds forever, seeing humanity but never being seen again. This led to strange, abandoned paths and foreshadowing warnings carved into trees, telling people to turn back before the world disappeared behind them. The Druids, as keepers of this boundary, performed rituals designed to keep the spirit gates closed, or at least controlled. The contrast between the silence of these ancient woods and the tremendous power held in them is chilling. They believed the only true safety lay in respecting the terrifying power of the space between things, the unending night of the underground catacombs. In Roman and other ancient cities, the necessity of burial led to the carving of vast black networks of catacombs beneath the living. These tunnels represent a paradox, a complete, separate civilization dedicated only to the dead, running parallel to the one above. The Roman living walked constantly over their ancestors, a collective hidden horror. The sheer scale of these labyrinths is difficult to grasp. Miles of bone and darkness, where the air is still and cold and the only sound is the drop of water. This endless, artificial night was considered the domain of vengeful or hungry spirits, particularly during plague years when the catacombs were overflowing and the eerie symbols painted on the walls couldn't hold the darkness back. To the ancients, entering the catacombs was a profound psychological experience, a deliberate descent into a realm of ghosts and rot. Even today, explorers report an unnerving pressure, a palpable sense that the darkness itself is a physical weight pressing down on the living. The dead may be gone, but the persistence of fear remains deep in the stone. The iron coffin of the Etruscans. The ancient Etruscans, who preceded the Romans, were masters of tomb building. Some of their most elaborate tombs contained unusual iron coffins, sealed shut with heavy lead and without any traditional ventilation. These metal boxes were not meant to protect the dead, but to trap the spirit. The Etruscans possessed a profound fear that a powerful evil spirit could escape its resting place and plague the living. The iron coffin was a metaphysical cage, ensuring that the spirit would be permanently contained. Imagine the dedication to this ritual, the sheer terror that drove people to go to such lengths to imprison a ghost. This practice suggests a dark truth about their society. They were constantly fighting to keep an invisible, internal threat at bay. The silence of these heavy, dark iron tombs is a reminder of their relentless spiritual warfare. They are a monument to the terrifying idea that sometimes the dead are far more dangerous than the living. The Olmec head's unblinking stare. The colossal stone heads carved by the Olmec civilization in ancient Mexico are massive, silent, and unsettling. Each head depicts a ruler, but what is creepy is that they were sometimes deliberately buried shortly after being finished, their enormous carved eyes facing the silent dirt. Historians are unsure if this was ritualistic burial or an act of war, but the result is the same: the removal of a divine ruler's powerful gaze from the world. This massive effort to blind their own gods suggests a sudden, collective fear that the ruler's power, or the supernatural force behind it, had become too dangerous to leave exposed to the sky. These heads, with their heavy features and silent expressions, now stand as symbolic imagery of power willingly suppressed. They silently testify to an unseen crisis, where the only solution was to bury the very force that protected them. The unblinking stare of the buried head hints at a terrible truth the Olmecs wanted permanently sealed underground. The Roman god of silence and terror. The Romans worshipped a terrifying god called Vediovis, often depicted as a young man holding a bundle of arrows and a goat. He was not a god of greatness, but of the contrast between light and shadow, specifically the god of anti-Jove, representing the dark side of power and the silence that follows great destruction. Vediovis was mainly worshipped for a single chilling reason: to prevent him from inflicting damage. He was the force of chaos and vengeance, the divine embodiment of what happens when order collapses. Romans performed rituals simply to make sure this dark god would ignore them, praying for his silence. His existence shows the Romans' underlying persistence of fear that their order was fragile, always threatened by something older and darker. The need to constantly appease a god whose primary role was to wreak havoc reveals a profound national anxiety. He is the shadowed eyes watching every moment of Roman life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The eerie sarcophagus of Palenque, in the Mayan city of Palenque, the tomb of King Kinich Janab Pakal the Great, is guarded by an immense, intricately carved sarcophagus lid. The carving shows the king descending into the underworld, often interpreted today as an astronaut or an alien pilot, a chilling modern, speculative interpretation of an ancient horror. The true horror, however, lies in the Mayan cosmology it depicts. The king is shown falling into the gaping maw of the monstrous world tree, a serpent-like portal to the deepest level of the underworld. The terror is the certainty of his descent, the visual promise of being swallowed by a spiritual abyss. This elaborate artistic detail serves as a powerful foreshadowing, a literal map of what happens after death. The lid wasn't meant to simply cover the king. It was meant to seal his journey into the dark. It is a cursed object of immense power, leaving an open loop by suggesting that Pakal's descent is not over, but eternally ongoing. The unseen watchers of the Nazca Lines. The enormous geoglyphs carved into the Peruvian desert floor, known as the Nazca Lines, depict complex animals and geometric shapes. The most unsettling fact is that they are so massive they can only be truly appreciated from the air. Ancient people carved these giant images for an audience they could not see. The rhetorical question is simple. For whom were these immense desert drawings created? The Nazca people had no means of flight, so they were carving for a sky-dwelling entity. This speaks to a profound collective belief that they were constantly under the surveillance of powerful, non-human star watchers, a powerful recurrence of a supernatural influence motif. The terrifying thought is that the lines are not art, but complex magical signals, a massive, permanent, eerie symbol placed on the earth like a welcoming mat. Even in their silent, unchanging permanence, they are a powerful invocation, waiting for the unseen audience to respond. We are left only with the silence and the unsettling knowledge that we are standing in the middle of a massive ancient broadcast. The Punic War's sea of cursed coins. After the brutal Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, the waters surrounding the defeated city of Carthage were flooded not only with sunken ships, but also with thousands of Carthaginian coins. These coins were deliberately defaced, melted, and thrown into the sea in a curse ritual. This was an act of profound spiritual vengeance by the defeated. They believed that by ritually destroying their own wealth and throwing it into the deep, they were condemning the conquerors to eternal poverty and ruin. They were making the sea a vast, watery vault for a cursed artifact designed to bring endless bad luck to anyone who touched it. Even today, divers who find these shadowed coins report a strange, unsettling feeling, a palpable sense of the desperation and hatred poured into the metal. The ocean floor near Carthage is not just a graveyard of ships. It is a repository of organized, centuries-old hatred, waiting for the repetition of its intended revenge. The silent watchtowers of the Great Wall. The Great Wall of China is a miracle of ancient engineering, but its thousands of watchtowers are its chilling secret. Each tower was a beacon, but also a tiny, isolated prison for the soldiers who guarded the massive winding stone serpent. These men were condemned to solitude and silence. The true horror was the psychological toll of the relentless isolation. Cut off from all society, staring out at the empty, endless northern steppes, many soldiers went mad, their fears turning into palpable spirits. The towers became centres of fevered delusion, and the walls themselves were whispered to be haunted by the men who died of loneliness. When you see the wall today, you're looking at a monument not just to defence, but to profound, imposed human suffering. The towers are symbolic imagery of the dark side of empire, forcing men to confront the deep, terrifying silence of the wilderness until it drove them completely insane. The wall is an eternal reminder of a hidden horror far deeper than any invasion. The Celtic hill forts abandoned power across Europe. The remains of massive earthen hill forts, like Maiden Castle, are immense and inexplicable. They were huge, protected cities, but they were often mysteriously abandoned, their deep, circular trenches left to gather shadows and silence. They were left to the liminal spaces. Local legends often avoid explaining a siege or war. Instead, they say the inhabitants left because a curse had fallen, a spiritual contamination that made the powerful earth itself turn hostile. The contrast is powerful, a place of safety suddenly becoming a place of profound dread, shunned by the very people who built it with such effort. The earthwork trenches are like massive, concentric, eerie symbols drawn on the landscape, designed to keep something out, or perhaps seal something in. The ultimate unsettling open loop is the reason for the flight. Was it a disease? Or did the earth itself simply open its mouth and tell the inhabitants to leave forever? The silence of the abandoned fort is the only answer. The unreadable cuneiform of the damned. The ancient Assyrians and Babylonians used cuneiform writing, but scholars occasionally find tablets with strangely distorted or illegible characters. These tablets are often found broken or deliberately buried in the corners of ancient homes, suggesting a form of writing that was too dangerous to read aloud. These are believed to be curse tablets or incantations written not to communicate with others, but to communicate directly with demons or dark spirits. The distorted script was likely meant to make the language unreadable by humans, yet perfectly clear to the dark entities it addressed. It's a terrifying thought of a language designed for evil. The intentional breakage of the tablet was a final, desperate act to silence the whispers it contained, a ritualistic plea for the curse to remain dormant. These fragments, often inscribed with an eerie symbol like a crude pentagram, are silent testaments to an ancient supernatural influence, a written contract with the forces of pure chaos and sorrow. The Phrygian rock tombs are blank faces. In the ancient Phrygian kingdom, modern Turkey, rulers carved massive tombs directly into towering cliff faces. The most unsettling characteristic of these tombs is their grand, decorated facades that contain no windows, no doors, and no recognizable entrance. They are simply immense, decorative stone doors to nowhere. These false doors were carved because the Phrygians believed the spirit did not need a physical door. It could pass directly through the rock. The stone was meant to trap the body but allow the spirit free passage. To the living, however, they represent an eternal silent barrier, a door that is permanently closed and untouchable. The sheer size and blankness of these facades create a powerful contrast, a bold statement of eternal power, yet completely unapproachable. They serve as an aggressive symbolic imagery, a terrifying, unblinking face carved into the mountain. The mountain itself becomes a silent, vast protector of the hidden horror within. The Aztec flowery death ritual. The Aztecs held a terrifying philosophy regarding sacrifice, believing that the sun itself was dying and needed human hearts to continue its celestial journey. This practice, known poetically as the flowery death, was a massive collective supernatural influence built on fear. The most unsettling fact is the scale of the ritual. The Aztec priests perfected the ritual, using razor-sharp obsidian blades to open the chest quickly on top of the towering pyramids. These pyramids were not just altars, they were massive blood-soaked funnels, designed to let the victim's blood run down the steps and stain the stone in a powerful, visible symbol of their devotion. The belief system demanded that the victim ascend the steps willingly, seeing their death as an honourable contribution to the cosmos. This chilling blend of piety and profound horror shows a society where extreme violence was not merely tolerated, but integrated into the deepest layers of their spiritual and social structure. The Roman practice of damnatio memoriae. The Roman Empire had a terrifying political punishment known as damnatio memoriae, which translates as condemnation of memory. This was not physical execution, but a systematic, political curse intended to erase a person completely from history, a chilling form of spiritual warfare and a true persistence of fear. When a person was condemned, every mention of their name was chipped away from public monuments, their statues were beheaded or defaced, and their achievements were removed from all official records. The ultimate fate was to be forgotten by all, to be lost in the empty silence of history, becoming a terrifying non-person. This practice reveals a profound belief that power rested not just on wealth or armies, but on memory itself. To lose your name was to lose your soul's anchor. The remnants, the empty spaces on monuments and the scarred faces of the statues, remain today as eerie symbols of Rome's deepest, most comprehensive hatred. Egyptian brain removal for mummification. The Egyptian mummification process was a sacred ritual, but it contained a grotesque practical step: the removal of the brain. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence and soul, but they viewed the brain as functionally useless, simply a bundle of nerves to be disposed of. The most common method was to insert a long, thin, hooked instrument up through the nose, past the ethmoid bone, and then simply stir the brain until it liquefied. This awful slurry was then drained out and discarded, often thrown away with the dirty bandages, a chilling contrast to the immense care given to the rest of the body. This casual destruction of the brain, the organ we now know gives us consciousness, is a powerful reminder of how alien the ancient world truly was. It leaves a powerful, chilling, open loop. Did they accidentally discard the essence of a person's identity in every single burial ritual? The silence of the sarcophagus holds the answer. The Spartan practice of crypteia. The crypteia was a secret, horrifying practice in ancient Sparta, where young elite male soldiers were sent out alone into the countryside, with only a dagger and strict orders to survive by any means necessary. Their most terrifying task was to kill any slave, helot, they encountered, who was deemed too strong, too rebellious, or too charismatic. This was not war. It was state-sanctioned, random murder, designed to keep the massive population of enslaved people in constant, perpetual fear. The Spartan government essentially created a culture of hidden horror, teaching their youth to be silent, invisible hunters who targeted anyone showing too much hope or strength. The terror was the lack of warning. Any enslaved person could be killed at any moment by an unseen enemy dressed only in shadows and darkness. This practice reveals the core of Spartan power, a relentless psychological campaign based on absolute, violent dread and the constant foreshadowing of death. The Hittite practice of animal substitution. The Hittite civilization, a great power in ancient Anatolia, had strange rituals for warding off plague and sickness. In one common ritual, a sick person would rub an animal, such as a lamb or a goat, over their body, magically transferring the disease from the human to the creature. The animal would then be led far away and violently destroyed, often burned or thrown from a cliff, in the belief that the disease would be carried away by its spirit. This created a terrifying psychological image: an innocent animal, now symbolically infected, suffering a painful, drawn-out death on behalf of the sick person. This ritual is a terrifying example of ancient medical practice and speculative interpretation combined, turning a living creature into a sentient, cursed artifact. It is a powerful reminder of the desperate, often cruel lengths people would go to in order to transfer their suffering to something else and achieve a temporary sense of safety. The lex talionis and Babylonian eye for an eye. The famous Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon established the legal principle of lex talionis, or an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. While this sounds like simple justice, in practice, it often led to gruesome and terrifying retributive punishments that escalated violence and fear throughout the social order. One particularly disturbing law stated that if a builder constructed a house that later collapsed and killed the homeowner's son, then the builder's own son would be executed. This system of repetition of violence meant that your fate was tied not just to your own actions, but to the professional failure of your father, introducing an unpredictable layer of dread. This law turned justice into a cold, brutal machine where vengeance was the goal, not restoration. The code reveals a culture where the fear of someone else's mistake costing you your child's life was a permanent, terrifying anxiety, a terrifying system of collective dread and legal foreshadowing, the Roman glacial torture of Trajan. The Roman Emperor Trajan was recorded as using a gruesome non-military form of execution for perceived enemies of the state. He would order a person to be stripped, bound, and left overnight in the freezing cold of a mountain winter. This slow, silent death by exposure was considered a profound punishment. The horror lies in the intentional, cruel use of the environment itself as the weapon. The victim was not killed by a swift blow, but by the slow, relentless, painful invasion of the cold, which would turn the body stiff and blue. It was an extremely personalized, agonizing punishment that created a chilling contrast with the warmth of the imperial city. This method was designed to produce an extreme psychological effect on the populace, creating a persistence of fear that nature itself, controlled by the emperor, was an enemy. The image of the frozen, silent body, turned into a strange blue statue, was a terrifying symbolic imagery of the price of disloyalty to the absolute power of the emperor. The Minoan bull, leaping right's deadly fall. The Minoan civilization on Crete practiced a mysterious ritual called bull leaping, where acrobats would grab the horns of a charging bull and attempt to vault over its back. While often portrayed as a sporting event, the ritual was deeply sacred and extremely dangerous, often leading to death. The creepiest interpretations suggest that these ritualistic deaths were not accidents, but intentional sacrifices, a dangerous form of human lottery designed to appease the earth gods who rule the volatile, earthquake-prone island. The victims were often young, talented acrobats chosen to offer their lives. The silence after the fall, after the immense panting animal had passed, must have been a crushing moment of collective dread. The ritual was a reminder that the gods of the earth demanded the best and the brightest. This constant accepted loss created a pervasive, underlying culture of liminal spaces, a civilization constantly hovering between life and death. The Assyrian practice of flaying enemies. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was known for its terrifying and brutal military tactics, particularly the widespread practice of flaying, peeling the skin off their defeated enemies while they were still alive. This was not a quick killing, but a prolonged, agonizing form of execution. The most gruesome detail is that the Assyrians would then drape the bloody skin of the defeated rulers and military leaders over the walls of the conquered city. This was a chilling, aggressive form of symbolic imagery, turning the bodies of the dead into a terrifying tapestry of warning for anyone who dared to oppose the empire. This extreme violence served a powerful psychological purpose, injecting collective dread and absolute submission into all neighbouring states. The image of the blood-drenched, flayed skin hanging silently from the stone walls is one of the most primal hidden horrors of the ancient world, a true testament to the cruelty of power. The pre-Columbian practice of trophy heads. In various pre-Columbian cultures of the Americas, particularly the Nazca and Jivaro, the collection and ritual treatment of enemy heads were common. These were not just souvenirs, but cursed artifacts believed to contain the powerful spiritual essence, or tsansa, of the victim. The Jivaro would shrink the heads through a complex heating process, believing that by shrinking the skull, they were permanently containing the enemy's spirit, preventing it from escaping and seeking revenge. This entire process was an intense, deliberate act of spiritual control and supernatural influence. The terrifying implication is that every home or temple containing a trophy head was an active centre of spiritual warfare, a room where a captive, angry soul was permanently trapped. The tiny, silent, closed-eyed heads stand as a profound, unnerving repetition of this ancient, violent fear of the afterlife. The Sumerian demon cages of clay. The ancient Sumerians, when performing exorcisms for madness or disease, would not simply pray for the demon to leave, they would ritualistically trap the malignant spirit into a small, purpose-built clay jar, which they called a demon cage. This practice speaks of a terrifying speculative interpretation of spiritual illness. After the demon was believed to be trapped, the priest would seal the clay jar with pitch, ensuring the spirit was permanently contained. These small, humble clay pots, often found buried under the thresholds of houses, are the cursed artifacts of the ancient world, tiny prisons for pure evil. The horrifying implication is that the ancient world was constantly living among thousands of these silent, hidden cages. The persistence of fear was that if a jar were ever cracked or unearthed, the madness or disease would instantly escape and return to the surface, causing a collective, localized catastrophe for the unlucky village. The Greek Hippocratic Oath's chilling exception, the famous Hippocratic Oath, sworn by ancient Greek physicians, includes a line where the doctor promises to never give a patient a deadly medicine or advise such a path. However, a less-known clause suggested that a physician could be compelled to assist in an act of communal or religious poisoning. This chilling exception reveals a dangerous open loop in medical ethics. The doctor's loyalty was first to the community, not the individual. In times of panic or religious command, the person sworn to save your life could also become the one mandated to take it. A terrifying inversion of trust. This practice instilled a subtle, pervasive dread of one's own physician, who held the power of life and death, sanctioned by the state or the temple. It suggests a time where medicine was just as likely to be a tool for state control as it was for healing, creating a terrifying hidden horror lurking in the seemingly safe places. The Aztec fear of the Day of Zero. The Aztec calendar was a masterpiece of complexity, but built into its structure was a profound source of collective dread, the fear that after every 52-year cycle, the sun would fail to rise. The final night of the cycle was known as the Binding of the Years, or the Day of Zero. During this night, all fires were deliberately extinguished, and the entire civilization waited in absolute, terrifying darkness, believing demons would descend and devour the world. This voluntary plunge into the abyss was an aggressive contrast to their normal, sun-worshipping life. If the sun did not rise, the end had come. The terrifying ritual reached its climax when a fire was lit on the chest of a sacrifice victim at dawn. If it caught, the world was safe for another 52 years. This cycle of self-imposed absolute terror was a cultural mechanism for instilling deep ritualistic fear. The Celtic practice of bog bodies. Throughout Celtic Europe, ancient bodies have been found remarkably preserved in peat bogs, often with signs of violent death, including strangulation or blunt force trauma. These bog bodies were not simply victims of crime, they were often sacrifices offered to the earth. The bodies were placed carefully in the bogs, which were seen as liminal spaces between earth and water, and were sometimes weighed down with stones or branches. This was a deliberate ritualistic act to ensure the body and spirit remained trapped in the soggy earth, appeasing the powerful, hungry nature gods. The eerie state of preservation, the skin tanned dark like leather, the hair and fingernails perfectly intact, means that we are today staring directly into the ancient past. These silent dark figures are the perfect symbolic imagery of the price paid to keep the earth quiet, a persistent whisper from the muddy depths. The Chinese practice of Ling Qi. The Chinese judicial system practiced Ling Qi, or death by 1,000 cuts, a terrifying form of execution that lasted well into the historical period. This was not a battlefield act, but a slow, public, judicial murder designed to maximize suffering and terror. The punishment was seen not just as a physical death, but as a spiritual annihilation. The slow removal of the body's parts meant the victim's soul could not be whole in the afterlife, effectively condemning them to a terrible, incomplete spiritual existence. It was a punishment aimed at the afterlife and eternal soul. The practice instilled a profound persistence of fear against breaking the emperor's law, serving as a terrifying foreshadowing of both physical and spiritual doom. The final, agonizing moments were designed to be witnessed, ensuring the horror was ingrained into the collective memory of the entire populace. The Roman decimatio ritual. The Roman army, famous for its discipline, also had a chilling form of internal punishment known as decimatio, or selection of every 10th. If a cohort of soldiers performed poorly in battle or mutinied, 1 out of every 10 men would be selected for execution. The soldiers themselves were forced to carry out the punishment, beating their 9 unlucky comrades to death with clubs. This act was designed to be deeply traumatizing, forcing the remaining 9 men to share the guilt and the blood of their friends, ensuring their absolute, terrified loyalty. This brutal, arbitrary nature of death instilled a psychological terror that transcended the battlefield. The soldiers feared their own officers and comrades just as much as the enemy, creating a true hidden horror at the core of the Empire's power. It was a terrifying use of repetition to maintain control. The Scythian King's Court of Corpses. The nomadic Scythian people of ancient Central Asia had a terrifying funeral custom for their kings. After the king died, his attendants, concubines and horses were all killed and arranged around his burial mound, or kurgan, to serve him in the afterlife. The most unnerving element is the positioning. The deceased court was often placed in unsettling, lifelike poses, the concubines seated, the horses standing, as if they were eternally frozen in a moment of service. This created a silent, underground court of death, a chilling symbolic imagery of eternal subservience. Archaeologists have found these shadow chambers perfectly preserved by the cold. To step into the kurgan is to step into a horrific, silent tableau, a permanent performance for an audience of one dead man. It's a profound example of collective dread made tangible, built upon the fear of the powerful dead. The Incan trepanation surgeries. The ancient Incans were masters of surgery, especially trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole into the human skull. They performed this operation to treat head injuries, relieve swelling, or, most chillingly, to release what they believed were evil spirits causing madness or seizures. The terrifying element is that patients often survived this operation, showing remarkable skill in ancient surgical techniques. However, the spiritual intent reveals a core supernatural influence on their medicine. They saw madness as an actual physical spirit trapped inside the bone. The resulting hole in the skull was a permanent open loop, a gateway between the patient's mind and the spirit world. It left the survivors living in a constant liminal space, perpetually changed by the forced opening in their head, forever exposed to the unseen forces of the cosmos. The Carthaginian Tophet burial grounds. The Carthaginian city had burial grounds known as Tophets, which were vast cemeteries dedicated to the burial of thousands of small children, often cremated and placed in urns. Many historians believe these were evidence of infant sacrifice to the god Baal-Hamon, a terrifying, eerie symbol of communal dedication. While some debate the cause of death, the sheer volume and uniformity of the child remains, dated to times of crisis, suggest a profound, desperate ritual. The Carthaginians may have believed that only the sacrifice of the most innocent could save their civilization from military or natural disaster. The Tophets are silent, massive monuments to a civilization that lived under constant existential dread, willing to pay the ultimate price. The thought of thousands of tiny sealed urns, each holding the ashes of a sacrificed child, creates a profound hidden horror beneath the modern city streets, the Roman custom of eating the fallen. During the Roman Empire, there was a deeply disturbing practice of consuming parts of the bodies of dead gladiators and executed criminals. This was not cannibalism, but a deeply held medical belief that the strength, life force, or anima of the powerful dead could cure certain ailments, particularly epilepsy. Known as medicinal cannibalism, this practice involved buying or stealing blood, liver or bone marrow immediately after the execution. It was a terrifying, aggressive act of absorbing another person's essence, a desperate quest for physical power and health through the consumption of human death. This practice is a shocking contrast between Rome's civilized image and its visceral brutality. The desperate desire to consume the dead shows a culture deeply afraid of disease, willing to violate the ultimate taboo. The market for human flesh was a constant, unsettling whisper in the shadows of the Colosseum. The Moshi sacrifices of the Peruvian coast, The Moche people of ancient Peru engaged in massive ritualistic sacrifices of war captives, often culminating in the blood ceremony. The victims were systematically stripped, bound, and then bled out, with their blood collected in special golden or ceramic cups. This blood was then consumed or ritually poured by the ruling elite, an act intended to renew the power of the sun and ensure the fertility of the land. The horrific ritualistic nature of the violence suggests a profound, existential collective dread built around ensuring the basic elements of life. Archaeologists have found mass graves where bodies show signs of both violence and ritualistic post-mortem treatment, a terrifying repetition of this bloody ceremony across generations. The silent, cold Peruvian coast hides the legacy of a civilization utterly devoted to the terror of its gods. The Egyptian law of tomb robbers. Ancient Egyptian law had brutal theatrical punishments for tomb robbers. The most terrifying decree stated that a robber could be impaled on a stake and left outside the temple or tomb he desecrated. This was not a quick execution, but a slow, agonizing public spectacle. The purpose was to ensure that the robber's body was never properly preserved or buried, permanently condemning his soul. By denying him the afterlife, the Egyptians turned the punishment into a terrifying supernatural influence, aiming their vengeance at the thief's eternity. The resulting dried, desiccated bodies, left as perpetual warnings, were a powerful foreshadowing of spiritual doom for anyone who dared to violate the eternal sleep of the pharaohs. The persistence of fear was maintained through these grim sentinels, silent and withered, guarding the sacred borders of the afterlife. The Vedic god of vengeful justice. In the early Vedic period of India, the god Varuna was worshipped as the divine judge, the keeper of cosmic order and morality. However, he was also feared as the god of terrible, vengeful punishment. His weapon was the pasha, a noose, which he used to bind and trap sinners. Varuna's influence was the most terrifying because he was said to inflict hidden diseases and debilitating afflictions that were impossible to see or cure, a true hidden horror. If you were sick, you knew you had sinned, and your sickness was the physical manifestation of his invisible, constricting noose. This constant internal fear of the unseen noose created a profound social pressure, as people knew their every thought and action was judged by an invisible deity who could inflict slow, painful curses. The shadowed eyes of this god were said to be everywhere, watching and waiting. The Persian law of ashen mutilation. The Achaemenid Persian Empire had a terrifying range of capital punishments. For crimes against the state, one brutal method involved forcing the victim into a dark, small pit of ashes. As the victim struggled, the ashes would suffocate them slowly, a suffocating, terrifying death. For lesser crimes, the punishment often involved the horrific mutilation of the body, such as the removal of hands, eyes, or noses. This was not just a deterrent. It was designed to create permanent, living, eerie symbols of state power, marking the punished person forever. This practice instilled a complete collective dread of the powerful, distant emperor, whose will was absolute and terrifying. The image of the silent, struggling victim in the pit of grey ash is a profound contrast to the grand beauty of the Persian Empire, revealing the cruel core of its control. The Greek medical practice of embalming the living. A seldom discussed dark corner of ancient Greek medicine was the use of preservation techniques, similar to rudimentary embalming, on bodies believed to be in suspended animation or coma. There was a terrifying uncertainty about the line between life and death. This led to rare but horrifying instances where a comatose person, wrongly declared dead, may have been treated with preservation herbs or chemicals while still alive. Imagine the profound, silent horror of being completely aware, yet unable to move or speak as the chemicals worked on your body. This represents the ultimate profound open loop, the chilling uncertainty of being buried or preserved while still conscious, trapped in your own flesh. It is a terrifying foreshadowing of eternal, conscious dread, where the one thing sworn to save you becomes your worst nightmare. The Egyptian demon of eternal shadow, Amit in ancient Egyptian belief after death. The heart was weighed against the feather of truth. If the heart was heavier, it was immediately devoured by the monstrous goddess Amit, known as the Soul Eater, or Devourer of the Dead. She had the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Amit's existence created a profound collective dread of the afterlife. Her entire being was the symbolic imagery of the terrible consequences of a dishonest life. The true horror was not death itself, but the possibility of complete spiritual annihilation, being consumed and disappearing from existence forever, with no hope of resurrection. The priests' fear of her was palpable. They spent fortunes preparing spells and scrolls just to trick the scales and prevent the heart from being found heavy. She stands as the ultimate hidden horror in Egyptian theology, a silent, perpetually hungry beast that embodied the end of all hope and memory. The Roman fear of the lemures. The Romans believed that the worst kind of ghosts were the lemures, the wandering, unhappy, and sometimes vengeful spirits of those who died a violent, poor, or unjust death. They were not glorious ancestors. They were the terrifying, forgotten casualties of Roman life, and they brought bad luck and madness. Every May, the head of the household performed the terrifying Lemuria ritual. The man would walk barefoot in the middle of the night, spitting black beans behind him and chanting to send the lemures away. This simple act reveals the pervasive persistence of fear, that the world was always full of angry, unseen ghosts. The black beans were believed to be magical, potent food for the spirits, placating them just enough to send them back to the realm of the dead. This annual silent battle against the invisible dead created a profound liminal space in every Roman home, where the living had to negotiate constantly with the vast shadow world beneath their feet. The Mesopotamian Pazuzu talismans. The demon Pazuzu was feared across ancient Mesopotamia as the bearer of plague, fever, and devastating famine. However, the strangest fact is that people carried small, terrifying bronze talismans of his grotesque, winged figure, not to worship him, but to use his own power against him. The speculative interpretation was that only a greater demon could fight a lesser one. Pazuzu was so terrifying that his image alone could ward off other evil forces, especially the female demon Lamashtu, who preyed on mothers and infants. The talisman was a cursed artifact used for protection. Imagine having to keep the terrifying statue of the plague demon in your home simply to ensure survival. This practice reveals a dark truth. The ancients lived in a world where the only defense against the nightmare was another, stronger nightmare. It is a profound, frightening contrast between home and safety, the vengeful nature of the Aztec Tlazolteotl. The Aztec goddess Tlazolteotl was the terrifying patron of filth, vice, and purification. Her most unsettling power was the ability to consume all the sins of a human being, but only once in their lifetime, usually at the very end. She was known as the Eater of Filth. The Aztecs believed that all the bad thoughts and actions a person committed would manifest as a dark physical corruption on their soul. In their final moments, they would confess these sins to her priest, and she would symbolically eat the filth, ensuring the soul could pass on. The profound dread lies in the knowledge that you had only one chance for forgiveness. This foreshadowing meant that every person had to carry the knowledge of their unconfessed sins, accumulating a terrifying, silent burden of spiritual filth. She is a reminder that the gods of ancient worlds were often terrifying and demanding entities. The deliberate cursing of Roman wells, Roman soldiers, when campaigning or establishing new garrisons, often performed a chilling ritual before drinking from a newly discovered well or spring. They would toss small lead tablets, inscribed with curses into the water, a massive act of supernatural influence aimed at their enemies. These curse tablets were designed to bring sickness, blindness, or slow death to anyone else who drank from the water after them. The tablets, often rolled up tight and hammered shut, were silent, hidden attacks, a form of invisible, slow-acting, biological warfare through magic and eerie symbols. The horrifying reality is that the Romans were perfectly willing to poison a vital source of life with spiritual malevolence, creating a vast network of invisible, shadowed threats across the empire. The water, the essence of life, was systematically turned into a silent, potent agent of death and disease, a chilling repetition of hidden aggression. The Norse world serpent's toxic sleep. In Norse mythology, the world serpent Jörmungandr is so vast that he encircles the entire world and grips his own tail in his mouth. The most terrifying fact is that his immense body is perpetually submerged in the deepest part of the ocean, where his venom slowly poisons the very waters of the world. The slow, silent poisoning of the sea causes the terrible, unpredictable storms that the Vikings so feared. They believed the constant turbulence of the ocean was merely the unconscious, toxic whispers of the vast serpent turning in his sleep, a massive, silent, hidden horror beneath the waves. The serpent's eventual awakening signals Ragnarok, the end of the world, but his current quiet existence creates a constant open loop of existential dread. Every storm, every rogue wave, every mysterious illness brought by the sea was a tiny reminder that the world was already dying, poisoned by the creature that holds it together. The Hindu goddess of smallpox, Sitala. In Hindu tradition, the goddess Sitala is both feared and revered as the bringer of smallpox, fevers, and other terrible diseases. She's usually depicted carrying a winnowing fan to blow away germs and a bundle of broomsticks to sweep them onto her victims. The terror in worshipping Sitala is the chilling contrast between her role as a mother goddess and her terrifying ability to inflict agonizing illness. She's the ultimate liminal space deity, representing the moment of fevered desperation, where life hangs in a terrifying balance with death. Villagers would perform complex rituals to appease her, knowing that if the offerings failed, the entire community faced a horrible, slow death. The chilling truth is that they understood disease was a pervasive force, so they personified it, giving their invisible collective dread a powerful, unforgettable face. The unseen watchers of the Mongolian desert, ancient Mongolian and Siberian shamans, had a deep and terrifying respect for the vast, empty landscapes, believing they were populated by invisible, territorial spirits called Ongon. These spirits were highly sensitive to human presence and could cause severe illness or death for simple trespass. The shamans would create small, crude cloth dolls or wooden carvings, placing them on high ground to act as eerie symbols and physical anchors for the spirits. These dolls were seen not as toys, but as powerful, watchful extensions of the invisible forces of the land, cursed artifacts of the natural world. The pervasive persistence of fear meant that every journey across the empty steppe was a spiritual negotiation. Travellers always had to leave a silent offering to the small, shadowed doll watchers, knowing that a failed ritual would bring immediate, unseen and fatal consequences from the silent land itself. The Aztec monster of the earth's gaping mouth. The Aztec earth goddess Tlaltecutli was the terrifying personification of the world's surface. She was a giant, monstrous entity, often depicted with a gaping, tooth-filled mouth, who was so terrifying that the gods had to kill and dismember her to create the world. The Aztecs believed that every time she was shown, her awful face had to be covered, or she had to be shown squatting to minimize the terror of her sprawling, hungry form. Her massive mouth was the eternal open loop to the underworld, forever hungry for blood and sacrifice to sustain the living. The truth is that every person was living on the back of a perpetually ravenous beast. This profound foreshadowing meant that the very ground beneath their temples was a temporary, uneasy shield over a bottomless silent hunger. The earth was not a nurturing mother, but a colossal, demanding monster. The Scandinavian Draugr, the Grave Walkers. In Norse and Scandinavian folklore, the Draugr were not friendly ghosts, but terrifyingly physical undead beings who guarded their burial mounds and possessed superhuman strength, a clear supernatural influence on their belief system. They were the most feared of all the spiritual creatures. The Draugr retained much of their intelligence and malice, often haunting their victims with visions, smells of decay, and the chilling sound of their slow, dragging footsteps through the midnight snow. Their power came from the wealth buried with them, making the burial mound a powerful cursed artifact and a constant threat. The only way to kill a Draugr permanently was to decapitate it, burn the body and scatter the ashes in the sea. This elaborate, terrifying process shows the deep collective dread they felt for this particular kind of undead. It reveals a culture where the dead truly did not rest, but waited to claim their former neighbours. The Roman Curse of the Defictiones. The Roman curse tablets, or Defictiones, were essentially magical prayers for revenge, written on lead or pewter and often nailed with a bronze spike through the name of the victim. This physical act was meant to pin the victim's spirit and luck down to the underworld. The most disturbing repetition is how often the curses focused on small, daily fears: a thief who stole an item, a rival in court, or a lover. This shows that the Romans' greatest fear was not war, but the invisible small cruelties of daily life that could be secretly repaid with eternal damnation. These curses were often deposited in graves, wells, or hidden in the walls of temples, all liminal spaces where the barrier to the dead was thin. The terrifying reality is that thousands of these tiny silent metal sheets, each a plea for destruction, still exist, a permanent hidden horror lurking beneath the ground. The Egyptian myth of the ape god, Babi. In Egyptian mythology, Babi was a terrifying baboon god known for his thirst for blood and his aggressive, unpredictable sexual appetite. He was described as living on the entrails of the wicked and ruling the darkest, most terrifying corner of the underworld. Babi represented the dangerous, bestial side of humanity, the uncontrollable urges that threatened to destroy civilization from within. His power was a terrifying contrast to the ordered cosmos of the sun god Ra. He was the chaotic darkness that every Egyptian feared might claim them after death. The only way to appease him was through complicated rituals designed to distract him from the heart that was being weighed. The very existence of a god whose power was based on pure, terrifying lust and violence reveals a profound underlying persistence of fear of the beast within themselves. The Mayan belief in the Xibalba Road. The Mayan underworld, Xibalba, was not a place of fire, but a long, terrifying journey filled with trials and demons. The most terrifying challenge was the road itself, which was guarded by 4 distinct pairs of demons who existed only to kill and torture the deceased spirit. These demons included one pair who stabbed travellers with lances, another who preyed on the sick, and a third pair who simply caused one to spontaneously swell and burst. This intricate, horrifying map of the afterlife created a profound foreshadowing of agony for every living Mayan. The complexity of the underworld reveals a culture obsessed with spiritual torture. The ultimate terror was not the arrival, but the journey itself, knowing that the last thing your soul would experience was an eternal, silent run for its life against specialized malicious demons, the Greek Lamia, the child thief. In Greek mythology, Lamia was a beautiful queen who became a terrifying, child-devouring monster, cursed by the goddess Hera. She was depicted as having a woman's upper body and a serpent's lower body, forever wandering the night, hunting the children of others out of jealousy. The story was used as a chilling whisper to control children and instill collective dread in parents. The true horror is that the myth provided a terrifying visible face for the inexplicable tragedy of infant death and disease, turning natural sorrow into a spiritual predatory enemy. Her power was also a terrifying form of speculative interpretation on the nature of female anger, suggesting that jealousy could transform a human into a beastly spirit. She is the perfect symbolic imagery of the nightmare that lives just outside the window, watching the silent, sleeping house. The Chinese myth of the corpse eater. In ancient Chinese folklore, there was a specific class of malevolent spirits known as the corpse eaters. These were ghosts who, unable to find peace, would secretly return to their own graves and consume the decaying flesh of their own bodies, sustaining their terrifying, unnatural existence. The horror is the profound violation of the cycle of life and death, creating a terrifying open loop of self-consumption. It suggests a spiritual death so complete that the ghost is forced to feed on its own physical decay just to remain a painful, shadowed entity in the world. To prevent this gruesome event, families would sometimes place special charms or sharp objects in the grave, hoping to cut or injure the returning spirit and drive it away. This widespread practice reveals a deep repetition of the fear that the dead do not just rest, but actively seek out their own decay. The Persian demon of madness, Ishma. In ancient Persian Zoroastrianism, Ishma was a terrifying demon, the personification of the destructive rage, lust, and violence that leads to chaos. He was referred to as the demon with the blood-smeared spear, and his greatest power was the ability to drive humans instantly and irrevocably insane. Ishma's influence was the most dangerous because he preyed on the mind, turning friends against friends and leaders against their people. The constant fear of the hidden horror of madness created a profound social anxiety, where any moment of sudden rage or irrationality was a sign of demonic possession. The priest taught that Ishma was constantly roaming the earth, looking for minds to break. This profound persistence of fear that a single dark whisper could destroy your sanity created a pervasive spiritual vulnerability, a terrifying internal liminal space where the demon lurked. The Norse Jotun of frost and cold, Ymir in Norse creation myth, the entire world, including the gods and humans, was formed from the massive, cold, frozen body of the primordial giant Ymir. He was not a god, but a cosmic entity of frost whose immense silent death gave birth to all of existence. The terrifying truth is that Ymir's spirit was never truly destroyed. It was simply diffused into the physical world. The cold of the deep winter, the crushing weight of the glaciers, and the sheer silence of the frozen wasteland are all seen as the lingering, resentful presence of the dying giant. The belief that they lived on the massive, cold corpse of a monster created a profound collective dread of nature's indifference. The bitterest winter was not just weather. It was a physical sign of the giant's lingering hostility, a terrifying contrast between life and the foundational ice of death. The Etruscan demon Charon, the ferryman of death. The Etruscans, who heavily influenced the Romans, had a unique and terrifying demon called Charon, not to be confused with the Greek Charon. He was the psychopomp, or guide, of the dead, depicted with a massive, hideous face, often a hooked nose and tusks, and carrying a heavy hammer. Charon's role was to collect the souls and guide them, but his method was brutal. He would smash the head of the dead person with his hammer to ensure they were truly gone and unable to return. This terrifying symbolic imagery created an ultimate foreshadowing of violence, even after life had ended. The Etruscans commissioned tomb paintings showing Charon watching over the entrance, reinforcing the profound persistence of fear that death was not a peaceful sleep, but a forced, brutal passage conducted by a terrifying entity who required absolute submission. The Mesopotamian Gala demons of the deep. The Mesopotamians feared the Gala, terrifying underworld demons whose only task was to drag victims, both living and dead, down into the depths of the dust-choked land of no return. They were typically depicted with bullhorns and lion claws, but were often invisible. The supernatural influence of the Gala was constant because they were believed to be lurking in every deep hole, every shadowed doorway, and every abandoned structure. The fear was simple. The ground itself was unstable and could open at any moment to reveal the Gala, pulling you down. This constant, unseen threat created a profound sense of anxiety about simply walking outside. It is a terrifying whisper that the demons of the underworld are not distant, but constantly waiting for the perfect liminal space to briefly open and allow them to execute their terrible, silent purpose. The Vedic god of death, Yama's twin. In Hindu and Vedic tradition, the first mortal to die was Yama, who became the terrifying king of the dead and the divine judge. However, his sister Yami was believed to be the terrifying female entity who guides the dead and is the dark counterpart to his judgment. The myth is unsettling because it suggests the very first human death was not a tragedy, but a spiritual and cosmic necessity that created the kingdom of the dead. This original necessary death created a permanent shadow template for all subsequent suffering and finality. Yama, and the spiritual domain he rules, is a profound and terrifying repetition of this first death, a constant reminder that all life must pass through his unforgiving, silent gates. The ancient belief system was founded on the terrifying absolute certainty of a brutal spiritual justice. The Chinese practice of the spirit ladder. In ancient Chinese funeral rites, families would sometimes place a tall, unstable ladder made of silk or bamboo near the deceased's coffin. This ladder was called the spirit ladder, and was believed to be the precarious final path for the soul to climb out of the grave and into the heavens. The terrifying element is the ladder's flimsiness and instability, emphasizing the agonizing, uncertain nature of the soul's journey. The entire ritual was an act of profound speculative interpretation, believing that the spirit's ascent was not guaranteed, but required this frightening final physical act. Imagine the collective dread of the surviving family, watching the flimsy ladder sway in the wind, knowing that a misstep meant the soul was doomed to wander. It is an enduring, eerie symbol of the ultimate open loop, the final silent moment where a loved one's eternity is entirely in the hands of a fragile material object. The curse of the Hittite queen Puduhepa. The Hittite queen Puduhepa, a powerful royal figure, wrote a terrifying, elaborate curse to punish a governor who had stolen property from a local temple. Her curse was not a simple death wish. It was a prayer that the governor would suffer from endless nightmares and spiritual paralysis. Her words were specific. She asked the gods to inflict sleeplessness of the heart, an agonizing mental torture where the victim could never find rest. The curse was a form of psychological spiritual attack, aimed at destroying the victim's sanity rather than their body. This curse reveals a chilling belief that the true weapon of the gods was not fire or flood, but the destruction of the mind, a profound and terrifying hidden horror. It is a powerful whisper from a royal figure, an ancient reminder that the most agonizing punishment is often the one that leaves the body perfectly intact. The Greek Keras, the harbingers of violent death. In Greek mythology, the Keras were female death spirits, the terrifying daughters of the goddess Nyx, night. They were depicted as dark, winged figures with sharp talons, who swooped down onto battlefields to feast on the bodies of the freshly killed and drink the dark blood. They were not abstract concepts. They were the visceral, terrifying embodiment of violent, sudden death, an undeniable foreshadowing for every Greek soldier. The Keras created a profound persistence of fear that your last moments would be spent in agony, surrounded by these terrifying, feasting female demons. The Keras embody the profound, primal fear of a terrible end. They are the ultimate symbolic imagery of the chaos and bloodlust that the Greeks knew waited for every man, an aggressive liminal space between life and death that was instantly and violently crossed. the Mesopotamian practice of the masmas. The Mesopotamian priests, known as Ashipu or masmas, were not just healers but ritual experts who specialized in tracking down and removing demons and malevolent spirits causing disease. Their power came from their ability to name and describe the spirits, making them visible to the living. The terrifying element is that these priests kept vast, detailed scrolls of the thousands of different demons, each one linked to a specific ailment, fear, or misfortune. The sheer length and detail of these demon lists created a profound sense of collective dread that the world was utterly saturated with evil entities. These scrolls, filled with eerie symbols and complex incantations, were cursed artifacts of immense spiritual power and often too dangerous for a common person to even look at. They were a permanent record of the pervasive supernatural influence that controlled every aspect of Mesopotamian life. The Egyptian warning of the Book of the Dead. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was not a single book, but a collection of spells and instructions meant to help the deceased navigate the terrifying underworld. The most chilling spells were those designed to protect the dead from suffering a second death, an ultimate final annihilation. This concept of a second death, spiritual extinction after physical death, is the ultimate horror, a concept that dwarfs all others. It suggests that even the afterlife was fraught with danger, a relentless, terrifying environment where the soul could be destroyed forever. The entire book is a monument to a terrifying contrast, the desire for eternal life and the knowledge that the soul's journey was a brutal, difficult battle. The ancient Egyptians knew that even after they died, the great open loop of uncertainty continued, creating an eternal, silent anxiety. The Mayan collapse's silent hunger. The rapid decline and abandonment of the great Mayan cities, known as the classic Maya collapse, remains one of history's great open loops. Cities were not conquered, they were simply emptied. The most chilling theory suggests it was a profound, silent famine, leading to an organized flight from the cursed land. This famine was likely caused by a combination of severe drought and the Mayas' own over-farming, which stripped the topsoil. The people believed that their gods had stopped listening, and the earth was simply refusing to feed them. The land itself became a terrifying, silent, internal enemy. The chilling conclusion is that their magnificent civilization was destroyed not by invasion or plague, but by the relentless, quiet failure of the very ground they walked on. The ruins today are a permanent symbolic imagery of this ultimate despair, the terrifying silence left behind when hope and food run out, the Hittite plague that lasted a century. The Hittite Empire suffered an agonizing, nearly 100-year-long plague that crippled their power and ultimately led to their collapse. The terrifying fact is that this plague was not a single event, but a relentless, recurring disaster that destroyed multiple generations. The Hittite kings were forced to write to neighboring pharaohs, begging for medicinal herbs and asking detailed rhetorical questions about how to appease the unseen, wrathful god of the sickness. Their royal records read like a terrifying, century-long diary of death and desperation, a continuous, agonizing repetition of sorrow. The priests and kings came to believe the plague was an active curse placed upon their land by a distant enemy god. This unrelenting, century-long pestilence created a pervasive, eternal collective dread, turning the very air they breathed into a terrifying, invisible killer. The Roman curse of the wandering eye. In Roman folk magic, there was a profound fear of the malocchio, or the evil eye, which was believed to be an invisible curse delivered by a glance from a jealous or malevolent person. The terrifying part is that the source of the curse could be anyone, even a friend, creating a profound, quiet paranoia. To combat this constant, unseen threat, Romans would wear facinus charms, often explicit, unsettling images, or hang them from the doorways. These grotesque charms were meant to shock the evil eye, distracting it long enough for the gaze to pass without damage. The persistence of fear against this curse created a culture where eye contact was often avoided and jealousy was deeply feared. The terrifying truth is that they believed they were constantly living in a liminal space of vision, where a simple, silent look could ruin a life or bring instant death. The Mycenaean civilization's collective fire. The Mycenaean civilization, the Bronze Age Greeks who inspired Homer's epics, collapsed suddenly and mysteriously around 1200 BC in a period known as the Late Bronze Age Collapse. Archaeological evidence shows that many of their mighty fortress cities were destroyed by massive coordinated fires. The terrifying foreshadowing is that the fires often seem to start from the inside, suggesting internal revolt, panic, or a terrifying act of self-immolation. It was not a defeat in battle, but a collective spiritual breakdown where entire communities decided to burn their civilization to the ground. The massive, smoking ruins were the final symbolic imagery of an agonizing, self-inflicted end. The fire left behind a vast, dark silence, and the chilling truth that these great, powerful walls protected the citizens not from invaders, but from the darkness that they carried within themselves. The Sumerian ghost of uncared-for dead. The Sumerians possessed a profound fear of the Ekimu, or the ghosts of the unburied, the unmourned, or those whose funeral rites were neglected. These ghosts were not benign. They were vengeful, hungry, and driven by a desperate need to reclaim their place in the world. The supernatural influence of the Ekimu was believed to cause illness, financial ruin, and deep emotional despair, essentially rotting the victim's life from the inside. The Sumerians had detailed rituals complete with eerie symbols to appease these ghosts, paying them to finally return to the ground. The terrifying realization is that a person's eternal peace was not guaranteed, but rested on the meticulous care of the living. This constant cultural collective dread of causing offense to the dead meant that the silent, invisible enemy could always be a forgotten spirit, lurking in the shadows of the home. The Roman vampire burials of the swamp archaeologists have found strange, unsettling Roman-era burials in Italy, where the deceased were interred with a massive brick or stone forcibly shoved into their mouth. These were likely suspected vampires or plague carriers, a fascinating, speculative interpretation of contagion. The brick was placed there to prevent the spirit from rising and returning to feast on the living, a profound physical attempt to silence the dead forever. This was an extreme, desperate act of spiritual defense, a collective fear that the victim of the plague might rise to spread the disease further. This practice is a shocking contrast to the formal, ritualized Roman burial customs. The sheer violence and desperation required to permanently silence a loved one reveals a terrifying hidden horror. The belief that their own dead might be a silent, murderous enemy. The Inca mummy's unblinking watch. The Inca emperors after death were meticulously preserved as mummies, or malki. However, they were not simply buried. They were kept in their palaces, brought out for festivals, and consulted on important political matters. They were rulers whose deaths were only a liminal space between life and eternal power. The most chilling aspect is that the mummies were often moved and seated facing one another, creating a silent, unblinking court of the dead that still held political power over the living. The emperor's silent presence dictated policy, generating immense collective dread and absolute compliance. This created a spiritual open loop where the living were permanently ruled by the silent, judging eyes of the long dead. The mummies were a constant, terrifying persistence of fear, ensuring that ancient laws were never broken, for the ruler was always watching. The Chinese silk burial's vengeful spirit. During the Han Dynasty in China, some elite dead were wrapped in thousands of meters of silk, a massive effort intended to preserve the body and create a cocoon for the soul. This was intended to be a safe spiritual journey, but it introduced a dark side effect. The incredible labor and cost associated with this process meant that if the body was disturbed or the silk was stolen, the spirit would be instantly, intensely enraged. This created a highly specific, profound fear of the vengeful silk spirit, turning the tomb into a highly sensitive, volatile place. This is a case where wealth and power created a unique spiritual vulnerability. The exquisite silk, designed for eternal glory, became a cursed artifact that protected the dead with the threat of a powerful, maddened ghost, a terrifying whisper of destruction for any trespasser. The Assyrian fear of the rabid dog demon. The Assyrians feared a terrifying, unnamed demon that took the form of a rabid, wild dog, whose bite would inflict instant, incurable madness and a violent, painful death. This demon was the personification of rabies and the terrifying unpredictability of animal disease. To protect their homes, Assyrian families would bury small clay figurines of friendly, protective dogs under the threshold of their doors. This was not a tribute, but a magical substitution. The clay figure would be the first thing the dog demon encountered, hopefully satisfying its initial need for a victim. This reveals a profound hidden horror in daily life, the constant unseen danger that a beloved pet or a simple animal crossing your path could be the messenger of a terrifying, painful spiritual death. The tiny, silent clay dogs were a foreshadowing of death averted. The Egyptian practice of soul capture. The Egyptians had a few highly feared magical spells designed not to kill, but to permanently trap a person's soul, or bar inside a small figurine or a container. This spiritual abduction was considered the ultimate curse, worse than any physical death. Once the bear was captured, the person was left as a vacant, empty shell, conscious but unable to think, move, or speak. They were a living monument to the terror of spiritual paralysis, a profound and horrifying contrast between life and existence. This practice instilled a terrifying persistence of fear that a powerful magician could simply steal your essence, leaving you a silent, trapped prisoner inside your own body. The very idea of the shadowed eyes of your soul being imprisoned and forced to watch the silent decay of your physical form is the ultimate dread. The Greek myth of the Titan Cronus silence. In Greek mythology, the primordial Titan Cronus, father of Zeus, was imprisoned in the terrifying abyss of Tartarus after being defeated. He was not destroyed, but eternally bound and silenced. A terrifying symbolic imagery of supreme power contained. The Greeks feared that if the gods were ever weakened, Cronus would escape his bonds, bringing back the violent, chaotic age of the Titans. His silent, perpetual imprisonment was the ultimate foundation of the current world's order, a powerful, suppressed, supernatural influence. The terrifying whisper in the ancient Greek world was that the silence of the earth's deepest parts was merely the sound of the old god waiting. Any violent earthquake or unexplained chasm was taken as a sign that the immense, silent giant was beginning to stir in his eternal prison, threatening the repetition of cosmic chaos. The Anasazi cliff dwelling's final exit. The ancient ancestral Puebloan people, often called the Anasazi, built their magnificent multi-story cities directly into towering cliff faces. These remote, defensible structures were suddenly, completely abandoned around the 13th century in a profound, silent mass exodus. The eerie symbols of their collapse are the objects left behind: pots, tools, and even food, suggesting the evacuation was not due to famine or war, but to a sudden, immediate crisis. The prevailing theory suggests a combination of profound drought and internal, violent spiritual conflict. They believed they were fleeing a spiritual contagion, a profound curse that made their powerful homes unsafe. The ruins remain as silent, unblinking eyes in the cliff face, a terrifying foreshadowing that even the most secure place on earth can be rendered useless by an unseen internal terror. The ancient fear of the mirror's thief. Across multiple ancient cultures, including the Romans and Chinese, reflective surfaces like polished bronze, obsidian, and early glass were treated with deep suspicion. The belief was that the reflection was not just an image, but a literal fragment of the soul. Breaking a mirror was therefore the ultimate act of carelessness, believed to shatter the captured piece of the soul, condemning the person to a painful spiritual incompleteness. This created a terrifying self-imposed collective dread of the reflective object. The ancient mirror was thus a cursed artifact that was supposed to reveal the truth, but instead became a profound hidden horror, holding a fragile piece of your essence hostage. The fear was that the image could be stolen by a demon, or simply shattered, leaving the body an empty, soulless husk, the Roman god of the unwanted dead. The Roman god Manes was an unsettling collective deity, the name used to refer to the spirits of all the beloved dead ancestors. However, the Romans also had a deep ritualistic fear of offending the Manes, lest they turn malevolent. The most terrifying act was to anger the Manes and cause them to inflict diseases, nightmares, or bad crops on their own descendants. The spirits of your family were your ultimate protection, but also your greatest, most intimate spiritual threat. This created a profound, internal, open loop of anxiety. The people lived in a constant liminal space between ancestor worship and spiritual terror. The need to perpetually placate the spirits of your loved ones reveals a terrifying reality. The family circle was constantly policed by the silent, judging dead. The Celtic belief in the undying head. In ancient Celtic culture, the head was considered the seat of the soul, the source of all power, and the container of the spirit. They often took the heads of their enemies in battle, not just as trophies, but as a source of immense captured spiritual power. The most terrifying aspect of this belief is that the spirit was believed to remain active and conscious within the severed head for a long period. The Celt was essentially carrying around a living, silent, vengeful spirit, forced into an eternal, traumatic wakefulness. This practice instilled a terrifying repetition of war's horror, extending the battle far past death. The ancient Celt literally believed they were carrying the persistence of fear of their enemy, a profound, horrifying, speculative interpretation of the human soul. The Egyptian curse of the moving coffin. In the Egyptian town of Deir el-Medina, multiple accounts were found of families bringing legal disputes or difficult moral choices to the local temple. The priests would present the question to the dead in a special ceremony involving a moving coffin. The terrifying fact is that the coffin, supposedly inhabited by the spirit of the deceased, would physically move to point to the correct answer. The priest claimed this was the voice of the dead, but it was an aggressive, powerful tool of social control, a terrifying supernatural influence on human law. The fear was that the dead truly held the power of judgment over the living, meaning that your guilt or innocence could be decided by the silent, violent shift of a heavy wooden box. It is a terrifying, silent, forced whisper from the grave, commanding absolute obedience, the Babylonian fear of the Lamassu Gate. The massive winged bull statues with human heads called Lamassu stood as silent, imposing guards at the entrances of Assyrian and Babylonian palaces. They were designed as protective spirits, but their sheer size and terrifying mixed appearance instilled deep public fear. The dual nature of the Lamassu, part man, part god, part beast, placed them in a profound liminal space, representing a power that was always both protective and deeply unpredictable. The civilian populace was constantly reminded that the palace was guarded by something immense and terrifying. The terrifying implication is that the Lamassu were always watching, silently judging who was worthy to pass and who deserved to be smashed by their massive stone hooves. These statues are a permanent, eerie symbol of absolute, silent, intimidating power and the control it exerted over the populace. The Roman Mundus Pit's monthly opening. In ancient Rome, there was a specific, deep, circular pit called the Mundus that was ritually opened only 3 times a year. It was believed to be the sacred point of direct contact between the underworld and the world of the living. During the days the pit was open, the city would observe a profound collective stillness. It was believed that the manes, the ancestral spirits, were free to wander the streets, and that any physical task or military action taken during these days would fail. The sheer, self-imposed paralysis of the entire city during these few days reveals a profound, ritualistic collective dread of the spirit's temporary freedom. The Mundus pit created an annual, terrifying open loop where the living were forced to confront the terrifying spiritual instability of their world. The Minoan earthquake's divine wrath. The Minoan civilization on Crete was constantly tormented by catastrophic earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Instead of seeing them as natural disasters, the Minoans interpreted them as the terrifying, violent spasms of an angry, primordial earth goddess. The people believed they were living on the back of an unstable, sleeping entity whose anger could only be appeased by the bull-leaping ritual. The terrifying foreshadowing was constant. Every tremor, no matter how small, was a reminder that the world was about to shatter and swallow them whole. The persistence of fear was rooted in their own geology, creating a culture built on the terrifying premise that their magnificent palaces were temporary structures, waiting for the massive silent hand of the earth god to wipe them away. The land was not home. It was a vast, unstable coffin. The Chinese emperor's secret poison. Historical accounts from imperial China mention that the emperor's food was tested by multiple people before he ate it, not just for regular poison, but for a specific, secret, slow-acting mineral toxin. This was part of a terrifying, pervasive fear of internal silent plots. The horror is the assumption that death could be administered silently over years, slowly rotting the body and mind in an undetectable manner. This relentless, internal fear of betrayal created a profound hidden horror at the core of absolute power, the impossibility of ever truly trusting your own court. This constant anxiety meant the emperor lived in a perpetual state of shadowed eyes and deep suspicion. The supreme ruler was the ultimate victim of their own power, trapped in a silent, deadly game of slow-acting repetition, where every meal was a terrifying potential curse. The vandalism of the Egyptian sculptures across Egypt, the noses and sometimes the arms of pharaoh and deity statues were meticulously chipped away and destroyed. This was not random vandalism, but a precise ritualistic act designed to spiritually silence the figure. The Egyptians believed that the statue was the physical host for the spirit's power, and that the nose, the organ of breath, was the point through which the spirit received offerings and exerted its influence. Breaking the nose was a spiritual execution, cutting off the spirit's breath forever. This widespread, precise attack on the most vulnerable part of the statue is a terrifying symbolic imagery of the spiritual warfare fought against the powerful dead. These silent, noseless faces are the result of a terrifying, successful curse designed to permanently steal the Bay's power. The Greek myth of the Silent Sisters, the Fates in Greek mythology, the three Fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, were the terrifying sisters who controlled the thread of every life. Clotho spun the thread, Lachesis measured it, and Atropos, the most terrifying, silently cut it with her scissors. The horror lies in Atropos's silence. She makes no judgment, offers no warning, and cannot be bribed. The final, absolute moment of death is controlled by an indifferent, silent, powerful entity, creating a profound, inescapable contrast between human ambition and cosmic apathy. Their collective power created a universal collective dread because every person knew that their life's length was not in their hands, but was a fragile thread measured by an eternal, cold, unfeeling trio. The whisper of the scissors, unheard until the last moment, was the ultimate terror. The abandoned roads of the Incan Empire. The Inca Empire possessed an astonishing network of thousands of miles of paved roads. built with immense effort. However, following the collapse of the empire due to disease and Spanish conquest, these roads were not maintained and were quickly abandoned. The once vital arteries of the empire became long, silent, empty paths, quickly overgrown or washed away. This created a profound sense of open loop and spiritual defeat. The massive human effort was now serving only the jungle and the mountain spirits. These abandoned roads are the eerie symbols of a complete, rapid loss of purpose. They stand as a silent, powerful monument to the terrifying idea that even the most meticulously ordered civilization can be reduced to overgrown, meaningless lines of stone in just a few years. The Neolithic fear of the burrowing spirit. In Neolithic Europe, evidence from early burial sites suggests a widespread fear that the dead would not stay buried. In many graves, the body was weighed down by heavy stones, or the arms and legs were violently broken, a desperate final act of physical imprisonment. This extreme action was a ritualistic attempt to permanently prevent the corpse from rising and creating a hidden horror among the living. The earliest human societies were already wrestling with the terrifying speculative interpretation that the dead were an active, physical threat. The silent, violent struggle recorded in the earth beneath these ancient mounds is a chilling persistence of fear that transcends all history. It reveals a primal, universal dread that the line between life and death is not a boundary, but a liminal space that is constantly threatened by the restless dead. The final silence of the lost worlds, we conclude our journey not with a monster, but with the pervasive, profound silence that connects all of these lost civilizations, every single one of them, from the Mycenaeans to the Mayans, left behind one constant, the sound of nothing. The chilling truth is the contrast between their thunderous power and their absolute quiet cessation. This final silence is not peaceful. It is an active force, a vast shadowed space where once there was noise, fear, and life. This collective dread is the legacy of history, a terrifying foreshadowing that all human effort, all of our triumphs and terrors, will one day be answered only by this eternal, mocking void. And this silence is an open loop we are currently filling, walking on the same soil, making the same mistakes. We are merely the current caretakers of the earth, waiting for the final whisper of the wind to carry away our own civilization, leaving only the profound, unsettling silence for the next lost world. Now you know the secrets the ancients tried desperately to bury, the whispers they tried to silence, but the dark threads of their power are still out there, waiting. If you dare to keep peering into the abyss, if you want more hidden horrors, and if you believe that the ghosts of these lost worlds are still watching us, then join the expedition. Subscribe now, like this video to keep the light on in the darkness, and leave a comment below telling us which ancient curse you fear the most. The earth is a vast graveyard, and we are sleeping on the bones of giants, monsters, and civilizations consumed by their own fears. The Roman Empire crumbled, the pharaohs faded, and the Mayans vanished, but their dread, their collective, terrifying knowledge of the darkness, remains perfectly preserved. Remember the silence of the Mundus pit, the unblinking watch of the Inca dead, and the silent corrosive ash that suffocated the Persians. The only difference between us and them is time. What new terror are we inviting in now that will leave only silent ruins for the next 1,000 years? The shadows lengthen, and the ancient spirits are patient.